I'm really hoping that Square Enix someday wakes the hell up, because while they're busy chasing trends and abandoning what made their core game so special in the first place, a banger called Clair Obscur Expedition 33 just dropped, a game that is filling that void that we've been craving for over 15 years now from Square Enix. It's an RPG game that looks like a AAA game on its visual standpoint, and it does not shy away from implementing a turn-based combat. Yoshida-san, director and producer for Final Fantasy XIV and 16, said the following in a 2022 interview with Games Radar. One thing that we found recently is that as graphics get better and better, and as characters become more realistic and more photoreal, is that the combination of that realism with a very unreal sense of turn-based commands doesn't really fit together. You have this kind of strange gap that emerges. Well, one thing is for sure, the boys at Sandfall Interactive just did what Yoshida-san and Square Enix seem reluctant on doing over the last 15 years, and actually being incredibly successful in doing so. This is a company that has just released their first video game ever with a core team of 30 people. Even though obviously this game was not really only made by 30 people, there was a lot more people involved. These guys have sold 1 million copies in 3 days, and they have essentially tapped into a market that now has no competition. No game in the market now offers a quality experience like Clair Obscur. It's a game that looks like a AAA game in terms of visual quality, heavily powered by metahumans, megascans, and Unreal Engine 5, and with a combat system that is still loved by many, but since the options in the market are very few and far between, it's an open space for them. Most of the turn-based games these days are basically anime when it comes to visuals. There's really barely any game that taps into that sort of realistic or semi-realistic vibe. One of the only games that actually did that was Final Fantasy. But one thing that this company also made was completely shatter this argument of Yoshida-san, which makes me even question, where does this idea come from? It makes you wonder if Creative Studio 3 even internally made tests to create a turn-based combat system and try it out for Final Fantasy XVI, which they most likely didn't. Quote, "Some people are fine with it. They're fine with having these realistic characters in this unreal type of system. But then on the other hand, there are people that just can't get over it. I mean, if you have a character holding a gun, why can't you just press the button to have the gun fire? Why do you need a command in there?" And so it becomes a question of not right or wrong, but it becomes a question of preference for each different player. I understand that at the time of this interview, he most likely is answering the questions in a way to sell and market this game. But even then, I just simply completely disagree with this statement. Each type of combat system offers a completely different experience. And I'm definitely sure that Yoshida-san has complete knowledge of this. But as it's stated here, it gives off a very different idea. The gameplay experience that you end up offering to the player will dictate heavily the type of storytelling you are able to deliver to that same player. At least that's what I firmly believe in. The type of storytelling that you're going to be able to produce, for example, from a first-person action-oriented game that focuses on one character, is going to be very different from a turn-based combat game that you focus on a group of people. Or it's going to be very different from an RTS game like StarCraft, or a multiplayer-focused game. There are pros and cons to those choices. I do find that it's a bit unfortunate that Yoshi-san said this, because this is not the real reason why they chose this direction for their game. In the same interview, he says, and I quote, "As I said, I believe I know the fun of command system RPGs, and I want to continue developing them. But I thought about the expected sales of Final Fantasy XVI and the impact that we have to deliver. Some decisions on these big budget games that go above 100 to 200 million in budget need that return on investment. And so certain decisions have to be made to maximize profit. This is more of a Square Enix issue, to be fair. Putting a ton of money into one bucket alone with long development cycles and hope it ends up well. But this is kind of weird because Yoshida-san 2 years ago on an interview with Skill Up, he says the following: "Traveling around the world speaking with fans and media about their image of the franchise, they would always give the same answer, that it's turn-based, that it's anime-like, these teenagers saving the world, very JRPG. This was the image for all Final Fantasy. This was turning off some players because they thought it could only be that, and that was a reason to not get into it. On top of that, you have a generation of new players who were raised on FPS and games like Grand Theft Auto, where input is always direct. For these players, The thought of having to wait before you act is kind of a disconnect for that young generation. So with our goal to expand the series and broaden the audience, bring back players but also welcome new players, we realized we had to change the series and change it up from what people expect. This argument confuses the hell out of me. I grew up with first-person shooter games and games like GTA, but I can still appreciate other styles of games like Final Fantasy or strategy games in general like Total War games for what they are. Even though most Final Fantasies are very different from each other, there are some core things that are essential to a Final Fantasy game. One of them is being a turn-based game. And if you just completely ditch the turn-based system, you're basically denying that expectation that people have created over the years. Weirdly enough, Final Fantasy XVI reminds me heavily of Dragon Age: The Veiled Guard. Two games that deny, in my view, their original identity, gameplay, and type of storytelling. Two games that make changes in pursuit of a younger generation and sales numbers and ultimately failed. The writing, world, and gameplay of both of these games just feels incredibly shallow, at least in my view. There is nothing about both of these games that make it feel like a real RPG. What's fascinating about these two games is that people lash on to Dragon Age: The Veiled Guard, and with good reason. I did that myself in this channel, but the same doesn't seem to happen with Final Fantasy XVI. Obviously, Final Fantasy XVI and Dragon Age: The Veiled Guard make mistakes in a very different way, but I think that at the end of the day, at its core, a lot of the problems are very similar. We did have the news recently that Yoshida-san is no longer on the company board of directors. This was most likely a decision that he made himself. From what I understand, in Japan, this is something that is expected from you if you are a director, and things just don't go as planned. Obviously, Yoshida is still there, still strong, and with a lot of influence within the company. No doubt about that. It's also known that he didn't really enjoy that position, so it's probably a win for him also. In this video, I might be passing the idea that I'm not really a big fan of Yoshida-san. And to be dead honest with you, no, I'm not. I think a lot of the things that he says I simply do not agree with. For example, last year in an interview to IGN, he was asked about Final Fantasy IX Remake and he had this to say. Of course, I do know that there are requests for Final Fantasy IX to be made, but when you think about Final Fantasy IX, it's a game with a huge volume. When you think about all of that volume, I wonder if it's possible to remake that as a single title. It's stuff like this that I just don't understand. It feels to me like a lot of the times, the way that he thinks about these video games is that they need to be much massive than they were before. Kind of like what Final Fantasy VII Remake is doing by doing 3 parts in a massive sort of game. But man, I just think completely different. I think Final Fantasy IX as it is fine. If you're going to do a remake, just do exactly the same thing with upgraded graphics, voice acting, and some tweaks to the overall combat system to make it feel a lot more fresh and new. Look at Oblivion Remastered. It's essentially the original game with a fresh code from Unreal Engine and with some tweaks to the overall combat system. That's it. And it just works so well. You don't need to go up and above what Final Fantasy IX already has because it works. But I'm just hoping that Yoshida-san and Square Enix are looking at this massive and big example of Clair Obscur Expedition 33 and think like, oh, what we had was actually special and we just ditched it for some reason. All that I'm saying to Square Enix is give turn-based combat a chance, even if it's in a spin-off game. If Square Enix has the money and leverage to do a game like Strangers of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, they absolutely have the leverage to do a Final Fantasy turn-based combat game once again. That's it from me, over and out.